Prologue, Washington, D.C., Fall, 1982. A cool November breeze chilled the two men as they walked out of the metro station. They were both regular Army professionals who had served together for years and shared much in common, but with one major difference. The NCO was a veteran of the Vietnam War, while the chief warrant officer was not. They were in Washington for a couple of weeks of temporary duty, and since this was the weekend the Vietnam Memorial was to be dedicated, the sergeant suggested they check out the Wailing Wall, as some called it. The warrant officer agreed to come along. It seemed like a good way to kill a Sunday. They didn't know exactly where the wall was, but figured they could find it. The walk was pleasant. They exchanged small talk and watched the other people who were out for some sightseeing of their own. All in all, it was shaping up to be a nice little diversion. As they got closer, there were more and more people, but there was something different. The air seemed charged with tension. There was an unusual quiet considering the presence of so many. There were none of the noises associated with crowds, no loud talking, no laughter, only a murmur of low voices, a choked whisper. Then they saw them, the vets. Some were dressed in regular civilian clothes like any well-adjusted Jody, while others were in a variety of old jungle fatigue parts and bush hats, wearing these old uniforms like badges of honor, unwilling or unable to become Jody again. No matter what they had on or how they wore their hair, they were recognizable to each other. The sergeant saw it immediately in their eyes. A slight chill ran through him. He said to his friend, "This is spooky." Ahead of them was a small rise with trees to the left. People were coming and going over it. The wall must be over the rise. The vets that had not yet been over to the monument looked apprehensive and nervous. Each had the look of a small boy who was about to face a bully. He's going to face the bully not because he wants to, but because he has to, and the prospect scares him. As they walked up the rise, the sergeant was slowed by the weight of what he saw and what he felt. The damned rise was becoming a hill, a barrier. Unsure and nervous, he wondered briefly if he could go ahead. He knew he would, but he was not going to hurry. Then he saw the vets wandering through the trees, trying to make that final commitment to complete their pilgrimage. Drawn to this place like moths to a flame by an undeniable need. But they could not yet go all the way over the hill, nor was it possible for them to leave. Pain showed clearly in their eyes. Each one was an island in a sea of people fighting for his own battle against the hill, which had become his torment, his fear, his past, his enemy, his old familiar enemy of countless encounters in night sweats, bad dreams, and sleepless nights. The hill that knew how to dig into his soul and reach the embers of his deepest fears and stir them until they burst into flames of pain and terror that could still haunt him. The hill was now his only protection from the unknown that lay on the other side. There it is, he thought, using one of the expressions that had been part of the Vietnam vernacular. We have grown closer to our old enemy than we thought possible. Closer, in fact, than to our own fellow citizens. At least our enemy was true. He heard us, but he never surprised us or disappointed us. Ahead is this wall, built to honor our dead, to welcome us home, to assuage the guilt of our countrymen. Is it to be yet another insult? The damned enemy is less frightening to us than the unknown ahead. The warrant officer was still walking beside the sergeant, but they did not seem to be together anymore. He drifted away a little, as if he realized this was a private struggle his friend must deal with alone. The atmosphere was charged with an emotional intensity that one could nearly smell like a thunderstorm, dark, heavy, electric, and foreboding. The sergeant said to his friend again, "This is really spooky." But his voice was too low, and portrayed too much. He hoped it hadn't been noticed. If it had, his companion had the sensibility not to show it. As they neared the top of the hill, they saw the ones that were coming back, the ones who had just been there. There was something very different about them, about their eyes. They weren't here. They don't see here. They do not see today. They see an ocean away, a decade or more in the past. They see and smell the paddies with the water, mud, and feces sucking and pulling at their boots, and the punji sticks waiting to cripple and maim them. They see the paddy dikes offering dry footing but almost certainly booby traps or ambush as well. They feel the heat and the humidity that keeps the sweat dripping into their burning eyes. They hear the incessant buzzing and feeling the stinging bites of flies and mosquitoes, their ever-present companions. There are the smells of JP4 from the exhaust of a Huey, the smell of burning diesel fuel mixed with shit, the smell of bug juice, and the smell of death and decay. They feel the thump, thump, thump of the rotor blades, and smell that sour puke smell inside the choppers. Then there is the pop, pop, pop of small arms fire, accented by the crump of piss tubes, and the Mayday, Mayday, Mayday call of the pilot, who knows he has seconds to live before he crashes and burns. There is the adrenaline rush of trying to get to the downed bird to help the crew, hoping they survived, and the incredible sinking feeling of despair at the sight of the column of greasy black smoke, which means near certain death for those on board. There is the sight of the 6-year-old daughter of the village chief, tied to a tree with her hands and feet cut off, and raped to death as a message to the other villagers. There is the helpless feeling of screaming for a medic while cradling the shattered body of a young GI in your arms, as the blood gushes out in spite of all you do. Worst of all is the sight of broken bodies of the dead friends on the wall. Some of the vets come back over the hill to the trees and cluster in small groups, looking back towards the monument. They didn't talk. They just stood and gazed at nothing, at their past, at their souls, at their lost virginity, at their abbreviated youth. Some walked back to the top of the hill for another quick look to prove to themselves that they were finally remembered as the faithful sons of their country, and not as criminals. That the sacrificing of their youth was at least recognized. These were the 20-year-old men who had returned to such a cold reception so many years ago. There were no 20-year-old boys that returned from Vietnam. There were lots of 20-year-old old men that would never really fit in with their contemporaries. Old men in their physical prime, confused by the hostility from their former friends. Emotionally racked and beaten. Men too old to be young and too young to be old. Here were the boys who had become old men because of the folly of truly old men. To them, this wall was their youth, their lost and stolen youth. Others had memories of college beer bus, frat parties, and ball games. They had the wall, this long, black, cold wall. They soon returned to the trees to join the clusters of no longer young, old men. The urge to see this place was now satisfied, but they could not yet leave. Walking away from one's youth is a hard thing, even if that youth is nothing but a cold, black wall. There was a peculiar thing about those clusters. Where were the wives and children of these men? Why, there were thousands of women and children around. Only a few women were to be found among the clusters. They had that same look as the men. The families were hovering just outside these exclusive clubs, watching their loved ones with worried, uncomprehending eyes. They were not being excluded from the trees, but they sensed that those small clusters were not here, were not now. They were 12,000 miles and 15 years in the past. They could no more become part of these groups than they could raise the dead. They would not ever understand, but perhaps they would wait. As the two men reached the top of the hill They looked down on a crowd of thousands. They slowed their pace nearly to a stop and looked out over the scattered individuals, then groups, and finally a solid mass of people at the base of the wall. The somber dignity, the strength and unpretentiousness, non-glorious emotional impact of a simple black wall struck the sergeant like a hammer. They passed through the crowd and noticed it was made up of families, sightseers, relatives of those named on the wall and in their midst, but somehow isolated from them, the vets. Resolutely, these men went to the information volunteers, found the location of the names or panels they were seeking, then moved to the wall to see if the names were really there. They searched the panels, and when they found a friend, they quietly stood, or sat, or knelt, and brushed the name lightly with their fingers. After they had spent their time, they would retreat back over the hill into one of those clusters in the trees, their wives and children following at a distance.